Hello and welcome to part number 3 to the making of series. And I say this with emphasis here, especially because I have to tell you what I have done without telling you how I have done it. That's a challenge and I try to comply with it. But what I want to do here is, of course, give you as much information as possible to your benefit, so your tracking results will be better in the future. This is, of course, what I want to have. So first of all, what I have done here is to use footage from 6K down to UHD, and I have resampled it here to 95%. I like a lot, so it's more precisely, but what is more important is, of course, to evaluate the 2D tracking, and I will go after this short rundown more in detail with practical little examples, because all these tracking points here must be evaluated. If they move, if they have maybe something that is not really trackable, and these guys have then to be deleted. And as you can see here, close to the camera is everything green and far away is everything more in lilac. That means not so preferable, and that is, of course, based on just some reasons, which I will illustrate in a moment. More importantly, when you have done the 2D tracking and the deleting of the little mischiefs here in the tracking points, then the most important part is that you have a lens that has no distortion in it. Don't change that distortion back to something. It will only ruin your shot. And one thing that I can't emphasize enough, lenses have no crop factor. Sensors have, if at all. A lens is a 40mm lens wherever you place it. It's the same image that is projected on the sensor. So, and this needs to be known very precisely. If it is 40mm or 43, that's a big difference. The better you know it, the better you are off. Measure it. There are informations on the web available how to do it. The sensor size, very important to know it really in tenths and hundreds of millimeter if possible. And if you find something like an half-inch sensor, this is the tube size that was in the old days around the ray. And this is not the sensor size, so don't put in a half-inch or something like that. That's just plainly wrong. And the sensor is mostly just half of that size or even smaller. So these two values here, they are so important. And I have seen that even a good picture can be screwed up if these values are not inside. So this would be all for the attributes manager here in the making of. And let's switch over to the little tips and tricks. And as you can see here, that should be by now familiar. I have a vector in it, I have a planar construction and the position constraint. And of course another vector here just to make it safe and sound. You can see here maybe the planar. And this is very important, of course, to check. And I will give you more hints on how to check those things later on. And this here really tracked very nicely. Okay, so now to the tips. So tip number 1, when you track something like a texture, that can be windows, that can be a stone wall or whatever, you have to make certain that the tracker is not jumping from one patch to the next patch because it thinks it's exactly the same. Very important, have an eye on this. Sometimes the tracking points are very stable, but they jump from one frame to the next because they think this area here is exactly this, and it screws up everything. Tip number 2, tangential versus perpendicular. And as you can see here, these two dots are perpendicular to the camera, and these dots here are more or less tangential to the camera, so nearly in this way. And I want to show you how much that will influence the tracking ability or the precision. For that I have set up here a little espresso, and when I move these, you can see they move exactly in the same dimension, in the same units, but the same movement vertically here, the perpendicular one, they are really visible, but this is nearly invisible. And when I go here very close even to be nearly perpendicular to this, you will not find a lot of movement here compared to the vertical one. And that is something where I would have always an eye to have more the perpendicular tracking points than the ones that are tangential, because these give you not a lot of movement. Even the camera is exactly in the same spot. Tip number 3, edges or cylindrical objects where we have a not really defined edge. When I move here the camera around and I have set here the screen nose with a camera target, so it stays always in relation to the camera, so you see where the tangential is, then you can see the background moves but the edge not, and this is not a precise point to track finally. Of course, when this red ball is very small, then it might be, but only the edge is very difficult and it can slide even in a certain amount. Tip number 4, when we have crossing edges like this one here, and you can see here's the camera on the bottom and we have here an indicator just where the crossing point is. I put it a little bit up so it is not hiding behind the crossing point, and you can see that the moving camera gives a complete different crossing point each time. So it moves and the green sphere behind looks stable, but in the right picture you see it moves back and forth, and that would be the imprecision where it could be. So this is the error tolerance, for example, that you create from this. There's no precision in it. Tip number 5, and we have seen this before, that the foreground tracking point or features are green and the background ones are lilac. That means less quality, and that has a reason, because what we are after is not really the camera movement. First of all, we need to know where are these pixels are, and these pixels have the same X, Y, and Z precision than the foreground pixels. And that means we have to evaluate which one is better or which one is worse. And when we consider that this blue grid here is a pixel grid here, very rough to make it more visible, then we can see how much data we get from the foreground dots, the red and green one in the foreground, and how much we get finally from the background ones. Now consider that there's also on this speed of these points here a little bit lens distortion, then there's noise, and maybe there's something else, maybe heat waves or whatever, and then these points move differently from the foreground to the background here. And the quality is of course clear. Foreground pixels are always better. And that is why I delete more or less most of the background pixels and I focus on the foreground pixels way more. And you can see they have the same distance here, but as in tip number 1, it is a big difference. Tip number 6, and dolly versus pan, and this is nearly as true for dolly versus zoom, because we get nearly no information from pan or from zooming. We get only from dolly information. That means when we move the camera practically, and I show you that here, when we move the camera and have an eye on this green and this orange area, because they show really what happens here. And when I rotate only the camera, that means I pan, they stay pretty much the same. So we get no parallax information as we get it here from the left to right movement. Very important to know what camera movement you have and what to expect. Tip number 7, if you have a little bit influence to the shooting, then ask for head and tail. And head and tail means this area here. This is frame 0 to 90, and this is maybe frame 25 to 65. And you can see here the camera moves, and this would be now the head, the first part. Then comes the middle part, which you normally only get to track, but there's nearly no movement. And maybe you can ask then for the tail for a lot of movement, and that gives you a lot of parallax more. And you can see here where they cross. That's pretty much what information can be gained. And the smaller the angles here, the less precise is, of course, where is this point here. But in the moment I have a point here, I look from the left, I look from the right, and I have a nearly rectangular relationship here, and that means a very precise point, because now I know where the point is here. I have to take a look, where is it? And so if you can have a little bit more movement before and after, you get more data from the scene. So if possible, try to get this. Let's imagine that this sphere here gives a reflection one time in pale blue when the glass would be optical perfect, and that is pretty much never the case. And the yellow one would be when we have these distortions in it. I have prepared here the scene so you can see what happens. The blue one moves very clear and stays in shape, and the yellow one is nearly jumping back and forth and even splits at some point, so we get even 2 tracking points out of 1, which is of course pure nonsense. So anything that is in reflections is normally a bad idea to track. I would avoid this as much as possible. Inside of our tracking we need footage that is not distorted, and that means we should use a lens that has no distortion. Otherwise, any kind of repair of lens distortion limits the quality, and I would think normally 50% goes lost in terms of that, except when you have maybe 6K in footage, then it might be not that hard. However, when we have no distortion, you can see that the torus and the sphere in each case is on the same position. It means same speed, and we will get the same result. Let's have a look for comparison. When we take here a pincushion or a barrel distortion, and you see already there is some movement on the spheres, and we can do it even more extreme with a square or a sort of square distortion. And this is of course here only a simulation for the demonstration. Then we have a distortion that is maybe called moustache distortion. Not that simple to fix finally, and you can see the movement here goes in and out of these spheres, and here we see a huge difference in the background, and that will lead of course to a different result. And when you use such a result, the objects that you put finally in, without having them exactly distorted as the footage was, will show movement finally in the compositing, and that's certainly not a good idea to have. Last but not least, we have to talk a little bit about, in tip number 10, about tracker texture and the motion blur. And motion blur is of course something that we can't avoid with normal footage, and it takes the texture out of the whole thing. And when I take it here, for example, we see the texture here. It would create an idea what is the texture, and then when we move the whole thing, the texture is maybe gone, and it will be even worse when we have here a fast movement. Then we get a lot of distortion in it, and where is now the texture? Where has the tracker to be? Have an eye on this, and sometimes we have scenes where we have less or more motion blur in it. It's certainly something to consider. If you can shoot maybe with a shorter shutter speed, that is sometimes preferable, often not possible, and you have to make a decision what is more important. So I hope the 10 little points were helpful, and of course that's not all, there's way more, and I want to show you something here. When you have an eye on this dot here, have an eye when I move the footage back and forth. This dot was recognized by the algorithm as a dot that should be tracked. Of course, it's correctly flagged lilac. That means it has not a huge value. It is a little scamp, it's an escaper, and the software spotted it, but I would normally suggest just mark it, delete it, and get rid of it. You help the algorithm to get a better result, finally. What else? For example, the door here has many problems. It has a sign on it, which could be mistakenly done with the reflections here as well, or the background, or whatever. So we have transparent areas with reflections and labels. Very bad idea to have any tracking points here, except maybe on the label when there's no reflection, but maybe there's something. So speculars and reflections and the stuff that moves here based on distortion. The next part is of course then when you have a tree like this, and even if the wind is not really heavy, maybe there are some birds in it or squirrels, I have no idea. It's a very bad idea to leave this stuff here in. Next point, to track a flag, because a flag is normally that it moves a little bit, that it takes attention, but it shouldn't give you any ideas for a tracking point. Here we have also the crossing points. This light is not exactly on the same level as the flag, naturally. But we see here we could have some tracking points here, but it won't work because there's parallax in it, of course. Not so much, but it is. And the floor here has some reflection in it. maybe not nice, maybe not that much, but have an eye on that. And you will see after a while you find more and more points, moving points and escapers who are very stable all the time except then for the last 20 frames. So things will screw up your work. I think I could go on, but I think also you have gotten the main part here to get the most out of your scene. Thanks for listening. See you in the next part.